A number of posts have been going around on the Facebook forums claiming that if such and such a fairy tale was in the Bible, it would be believed as real by Christians. This has been unfortunately reinforced by several well-known biblical literalists who claim the Bible is, in fact, inerrant. With my more practical and jaundiced view, I believe that there's a lot more to it than many might be claiming. True, there are fantastical things in the pages of the Bible, including unicorns, dragons, giants, angels, and indeed gods. And in some cases, talking animals, all of which I will address in a video later on. However, a grounded and more open mind can not only be discerning about what can be considered metaphor and literal, but a simple bit of research into linguistics of translation can show that the reader's error, rather than the author's, can apply the fantastical note to the scriptures. That being said, would a fairy tale be able to be woven into the Bible and therefore stand as potential truth in the eyes of Christians, whilst also being a blatant fantasy for those of an atheistic or even mildly sceptical mindset? It was one of these posts that unintentionally started a very productive debate on one such forum. It is thanks to those who contributed, and I hope to link them later on. I shall definitely post it as well to share, and I'm able to provide a relatively comprehensive method of determining a fairy tale that would potentially have made it into the pages of the Bible. So let us delve in and see what happens. But let's start with some caveats. I'm not an expert on the biblical narrative, world building, or mythology. I have, however, been trained in oral stories by the great Sarah Rundle, and I've worked with people in the storytelling industry for many years, which anyone can find at folk festivals around Britain. This gives me an understanding of how stories are told and how they change according to the preferences of the time. Since I believe some parts of Genesis can be read as oral stories, like the Flood and Babel, you can find other videos like this that will tell you more about them. I'm also going to be using the grounding standbys of experimental theology, scripture, namely where does it fit into the biblical narrative and what cross-references can be made, science, is there a sensible explanation for it in the current scientific method, or something mundane that can have a fantastical origin, and history. Does it have a similarity to historical events only to be with a miraculous explanation? For a full explanation for my principles of experimental theology, check the link in the video below. So, without any further ado, let us delve in. Now, to the story in question. Which fairy tale is suggested to be a candidate for the Book of Grimm? They suggested Jack and the Beanstalk, a tale I've known told in several versions and parodies. Whilst the modern version of that name we tend to think of is relatively recent, from 1890, the tale it came from, known as Jack Spriggins and the Enchanted Bean, was first printed in 1734 and is believed to be based on an oral tale dating back 5,000 years to the Bronze Age. So, the potential for it to be in the Bible is in some way there. But we need to establish what we mean by the story, otherwise we leave ourselves open to bad arguments. The bones of the story have changed little in any version. Jack, who lives with his poor widowed mother, buys some magic beans. We'll just laugh at any notably large seed. They grow quickly into a towering plant that Jack that Jack climbs into the clouds, where he comes across the abode of a man-eating giant, though some versions say an ogre. He steals something of great value and has to kill the giant. On the surface, it's nothing too dissimilar to things that appear in the Bible already, and a helpful atheist provided plenty of biblical cross-references that can apply.
This is the series of cross-references I was referring to. Poverty and faith in 1 Kings, miraculous growth in Exodus, facing trials like David and Goliath, 1 Samuel, dealing challenges with biblical honesty, Exodus, I forgot that one to be honest. John defeats mirrors divine intervention, Joshua, truth air.
Where can this fit into the biblical narrative? Whilst a Quora article implies it could have been used as a parable by Jesus, I don't know if his style of storytelling would have been able to cover this in any meaningful manner. There's plenty that can be implied the story is about riches of God coming from above and potentially the devil being the giant, but that doesn't fit with the established narrative. Also, giants, or Nephilim, were residents of the promised lands of Canaan, and according to Genesis 6, were the twisted spawn of the sons of God and the daughters of man, and were never said to live in the clouds. With scripture notwithstanding, is there a way to give it a scientific twist? In theory, one can say that it's a tall plant that can get much more sunlight, and so will be stronger and potentially encourage growth like giant fig trees, or something else tall and fast growing, the mustard seed being a common motif of small but growing. This could be. Essentially, there's nothing natural we can think of that could be explained as the body of a giant or even the wreckage of the beanstalk, assuming such a thing would even last. History is an interesting one when you stop to think about it. One could say the story is about how small advances or the right investments could trigger a storm of wealth and social mobility if one persisted. This could be a tactic the church could use to encourage people to give tithes to the church, even if you're poor. And knowing how to use chapter breaks can break the meaning of the narrative into such reasonings which might be contrary to the actual teachings of Jesus. So we can't really rule this out. Going by my standbys, whilst I can see the early church councils using this story to promote and to giving to the church, and the beanstalk being a reference to Jacob's ladder, I can't think of any way it can fit into the current biblical story without completely rewriting the Old Testament. Add that to the common theme of Jack stealing from the heavens and getting away with it, and this story isn't that good to share with a good Christian child. So is there any way we can put a version of Jack and the Beanstalk in the Bible? Well, there might be. If we go through some of the older versions of the story, we might be able to find them. Benjamin Tarbert wrote The History of Jack and the Beanstalk in 1807. And his version mentions a fairy who meets Jack halfway up the beanstalk, the classic tale of poor Jack selling the cow for the beans being established earlier on, and tells him the history of his father, who was a wealthy man with a kind and loving heart, only to be betrayed, stabbed, and robbed by a selfish giant. Jack was tasked with killing the giant and reclaiming his father's fortune, on the condition he is as selfless as his late father. The first couple of times Jack merely steals from the giant and runs away. However, under threat of being destroyed by the fairy, he comes up once more, this time stealing the singing harp, which calls out to its master, and he pursues Jack, who is forced to kill him by cutting down the beanstalk, and then getting his father's wealth. So, we have a greedy giant stealing wealth from Jack's father, Jack being charged with going to kill him, only steals bits of his wealth back, resulting in supernatural punishment threat, and hence ending up killing the giant and winning back his inheritance. Could this be the version which enters the Bible? Honestly, yes. I can see it being a young boy born of Abraham's line, facing the Nephilim king in the promised lands that had been lost to Jacob and his sons, stealing from him to feed the family, and then when God pushed him to it, killed the giant. When looking into the Bible to check, I found a very similar story and a discussion about it. The story of Joshua and his campaign to reclaim the lands of Canaan. Many references are made to the Nephilim, or beings of comparable size, in Deuteronomy, Numbers, and Joshua, and there have even been mentions of their king living on a mountain. Could this be it? So, far from proving that Jack and the Beanstalk will never be in the Bible, have we found out it already is? Well, not quite. Only in the barest of bare bones. Only in a version that, to my knowledge, hasn't been that popular in the retelling, and missing the major part, that being the titular beanstalk. One could only, in theory, put it in there as a means of climbing up the mountain, and the only reference is that Joshua cut the Anakim off from the hills of their country. In short, there's no way it can fit in. So what have we learned? Firstly, the general story of Jack and the Beanstalk is far older than I expected. I was really quite surprised. And the basic themes could be cross-referenced in the Bible, and it can have a premise that would be heartily approved of by the Church Fathers, who compiled the Bible in its current form. However, there is no way the story, as we know it, can fit into the biblical narrative without rewriting the whole thing. Whilst one version has remarkable parallels to the conquest of Joshua in the Promised Lands, it's missing out on the major identifying feature of the titular beanstalk. Whilst interesting in concept, it doesn't in any concrete way fit into the Bible. This was, quite frankly, a lot of fun to do, not only because of the research I had to go and do, and the application of my principles of experimental theology, but also because it turned what was clearly meant to be a classic jab at Christian theology into a productive discussion and a fascinating look into the origins of an old story I've seen done in many ways throughout the years. I'm thankful for all of those who took the time to seriously consider the questions I presented and the information they provided. If it wasn't for them picking apart the Bible to provide references, this might not have gone far. This is going to be shared on the forum, so hats off to those who shared and participated. And to everyone else, remember, if someone raises such questions again, find the bones of the story, see if it fits the scriptures and the narrative, if the science is going to provide any discoveries to help, if history will help give us any sources for this potentially being a Bible story, or potentially matching up with a Bible story, and look for any other versions to see if there's any way that could have, in theory, fit in to any established biblical story. It's all there if you look. But if you pay attention, you'll also see when things are complete hogwash. So thanks for watching. Stay humble, stay safe, and God be with you, my friends.